Today's daf we're going to be learning is Avodah Zarah daf lamed chet. This is the daf for Shabbat. We're going to get started with the top of our daf. Amar Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak Amar Rav. Okay, so we have a statement of Rav Shmuel bar Yitzchak in the name of Rav, specifically about a limitation on bishul akum. That's our topic. Food cooked by Gentiles. We already saw yesterday. It's machlok at Rashi and Tosfot, or even a contradiction between Rashi in two different places. Is it according to Rashi on our daf because of maybe the Gentile will add some non-kosher food into it, or is it more of an issue of chatanu? We're worried that it might lead to marriage if you end up engaging in eating with the Gentile. So cooking will lead to eating, which will lead to marriage. Now we're going to see there's some limitations on it. So we're going to have two versions of what Rosh Shmuel said in the name of Rav Yitzchak in the name of Rav. Rosh Shmuel, the son of Rav Yitzchak, said in the name of Rav. If it can be eaten raw, no bishul akum. So basically that seems similar to it doesn't change its form. It could be eaten raw. So the cooking, it seems like the cooking really hasn't changed it. Hasn't turned it from something inedible to something edible. Besura manuhachi, that was the version in Surah, but Pupatita manuhachi. In Pupatita they had a different version. Amar Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak Amar Rav, kol she'eino nechal shulchan melachim lelafet bo et hapat. If a king's table, they wouldn't eat it on the king's table, to eat it with their bread. Ein bo bishul bishulei avdei kochavim. Okay, it's not going to be a problem if it's something that you wouldn't be fit to feed for a king. This is a big heter, because there's a lot of things that, right, either one or the other. Now, these are two different versions of what Rav said. But in the end, halacha l'maaseh, which is just interesting in and of itself, halacha l'maaseh, we paskin like both. If it doesn't have that, or it doesn't have that, right? If it can be eaten raw, or it wouldn't go on the king's table, then you're allowed to eat it even if a Gentile cooked it. It's very important halacha. My benayu, what's the difference between the two opinions? Ika benayu, dagim ketanim, small fish, which can't be eaten raw, but they would never go on a king's table, or aride, which are some sort of mushrooms, and truffles, which also, all of these have the same criteria, or daisa, which is they cannot be eaten raw, but you would never serve them on the king's table, like a porridge. Amar Rav Asi, Amar Rav, dagim ktanim meluchim ein behem mishum bishulei avdei kochavim. If you have these small, Rav Asi in the name of Rav, you have small salted fish, since they could be eaten raw, right, because they're salted, then you don't have to worry if they cook them. Amar Rav Yosef, im tzla'an ovei kochavim, somech Yisrael alehem mishum erevei tavshilim. If Rav Yosef says, if a Gentile were to roast them, you could eat them, you could even use it for your erev tavshilim, meaning this counts as a cooked item, even though it was cooked by a Gentile. V'yavdinu ovei kochavim kasa deharsana asul. But if he prepares kasa deharsana, which is a fish prepared with flour, it's forbidden, to which the Gemara says, pshita, obviously it's forbidden. Well, they say because you can't eat the flour when it's raw. You might have thought that the fish is what's the main part and not the flour, but they come teach you the flour is the main part. Kind of sounds like the debate about schnitzel, right? You're eating the schnitzel because of the crusty part on the outside, or you're eating the schnitzel because of the chicken inside. And there's a debate about what's the main part and what's not, and it's relevant for brachot, for what blessing you make on, what bracha you make on schnitzel. Amar Bruna Amar Rav. Ovei kochavim sheitzita ta'or ba'agam. If he set on fire a meadow, or Gentile, kol hachagavim sheba'agam asurim. All the grasshoppers are forbidden. So now they say, hechidami, what's the case exactly, and why are they forbidden? Maybe it's because we can't figure out. Remember, there's different distinguishing marks about a grasshopper. We had that yesterday. We can't figure out which is kosher grasshopper, which is not, because now they're all burned. You have no way of knowing. Well, my area of kochavim, afilu Yisrael nami. Even if it was a Jew who did it, it would be a problem. But if you say it's because of bishul akum, because they cooked by burning the meadow, they cooked up the grasshoppers, that's not considered cooking, because we're going to see right now, in order for it to be considered cooking, the Gentile had to have intended to cook. And in this case, the Gentile was just planning to burn the meadow, in which case we don't really understand what the issue is. Now here, let's understand why we know it's not forbidden if it's bishul akum. V'ha'amar Rav Chanan bar Ami, amar Rabbi Pedad, amar Rabbi Yochanan, ha'yovei kochavim decharish reshe. If it scorches, singes a head of an animal, shari lemechal minei, you can eat from it. Afilu miresh one, even from the tip of its ear or the top of its ear. Alma lavure se'ar kamachavim, because the reason why they scorched the head of the animal or singed it was to take off the hair. Hachinami, and it wasn't to cook it. Hachinami legaluya agma kamachavim, right? They were just trying to burn the meadow so they could get to the surface of it. So therefore, look, it can't be. So now we're stuck because we don't know. In other words, it can't be forbidden for that reason. So why is it forbidden? The real issue is it's really back to the first one. We don't really know whether the grasshoppers, we can't see whether they're kosher or not because now they're burned. We can't find the identifying features. Umas. So then the question was, well, from a Jew also it would have been, well, the case was that a Gentile singed it. So because of that, that's why they said it that way. But had it been a Jew, it would have been also a problem. So that actually had nothing to do with bishul akum. We just thought maybe it did. But in the meantime, since we're here, Gufa, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, right? We had the whole Amar Rabbi, it should be Amar Rav Chanan bar Ami, Amar Rabbi Padat, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. So now we're going back to if you singe the head of an animal, since the Gentile was doing it just to get the hairs off, you're allowed to eat from it. Amar Ravina Hilkach, therefore, Hayove Kochavim deshada sikta la tuna v'kaver ba Yisrael kara meikara shapir dami. Kaver ba Yisrael kara meikara shapir dami. So let's go through the words. Nove Kochavim deshada sikta la tuna. He put inside an oven a peg, and he wanted to basically what you do with the pegs. They would take some wood. They would dry it out first, right? So they would put it in the oven to dry it out and harden it basically, to turn it into a peg. Now, there were two processes that would happen. First, it would soften. By putting it in the oven, softens it. And then it would dry out all the liquids in it, and then it would end up hardening. Now, the softening process is actually kind of like cooking. Okay? It's like that's what happens to food. It softens when you put it in the oven. So what happened was this Gentile and this is we're going to derive from the fact if you're doing it for a different reason, it's not bishul akum. If the Gentile puts this peg into the oven in order to harden it, the kaver by Israel kara meikara. Now, the Jew put in a gourd beforehand into this oven. The Gentile puts his peg in, makes a fire in there, and burns the peg. In the meantime, the gourd gets cooked. So shapir dami, this is fine. To which the Gemara says, Pshita, of course it's fine. Why would you think it isn't fine? He certainly wasn't intending to cook anything. Well, you might say since the first stage of drying out that peg is actually like a cooking process, right? You might have thought it was a problem, but really in the end, even though we wanted it to soften so it could harden, really in the end the intent was for the hardening, and therefore this is not an issue at all. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Now we get to some very important halachot that relate to certain situations where Jews and Gentiles are together involved in the cooking. This could happen in a process it could happen in many ways, but certainly the most common occurrences these days is a restaurant, for example, where there's Gentiles and Jews working in the restaurant, or it could happen in someone's house if you have a worker who's a Gentile in the house who's cooking for you. So hiniach Yisrael basar al gabei gechalim uba'al ve kochavim v'hafach bo mutar. Right. Obviously, there's many other situations, but if a Jew puts meat on the coals, and an ovei kochavim comes and flips it, mutar. Okay, that's totally fine. Gemara wants to know, hechidami. What's the case that Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel that if I put on the meat and the Gentile flips it, it's okay? Hechidami. Ilema di iloha pachbe hava bashil. If the Gentile didn't flip it, it would never have cooked properly. Let's say it's a really thick piece and the heat would never have gotten to the top. Pshita. Obviously, right? I'm sorry. Iloha pachbe hava bashil. If he hadn't flipped it, the opposite. It would have cooked anyway. Well, obviously, it's not bishul akum, because I put the meat on. It would have cooked anyway. His action had no bearing on what happened. But if the Gentile hadn't flipped it, it wouldn't have cooked. That was the case I was saying before. That was so thick. Amay mutal. Why would it be permitted? Bishul kochavim nidu. That's a classic case of bishul akum, because that Gentile caused the meat to be cooked. So what's the case? To which they answer, lo tzricha. It has to be something in the middle. Di lo hafech hava bashal b'tarte shai. If the Gentile hadn't flipped it, it would have cooked in 2 hours. Hashta kabashal b'chadashata. But now it cooked in 1 hour. So now, why is it telling you this isn't bishul akum? Because you might have thought kiruva bishul miltahi. Maybe speeding up the process is considered cooking, and therefore the Gentile was involved in the cooking process. Kamash malan, therefore, comes to teach you no. Since it would have cooked anyway, the Gentile really didn't change anything here. To which the Gemara questions this from something that Rabbi Asi said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. V'hama Rabbi Asi am Rabbi Yochanan koshu k'machal ben drosai ein bo b'shum b'shulei ovdei kochavim. Now, let's first explain what is machal ben drosai. We remember from Masechet Shabbat, which is in a machal ben drosai, which there was a robber whose name was Ben Drosai, and he would cook his food quickly and eat it because he was always on the run. And he would eat his food either half or a third cooked. There's different interpretations. And therefore, it says here, Rabbi Yochanan says, if it's already cooked, machal ben drosai, cook it, let's say, a third of the way, that's already considered edible, and therefore, there's no bishul akum at that point. Akum could do the whole rest of the process, it doesn't matter. Well, the assumption of this statement is, ha'eno k'machal ben drosai, yesh bo mishum bishulei avdei kochavim. If it isn't a third of the way cooked, and then let's say the Gentile gets involved, it sounds like I didn't really cook it because I didn't get it to the minimum amount. So it would sound like if the Gentile flips it before it's a third of the way cooked, it would be a problem. Now, in the previous statement of Shmuel didn't say that. Shmuel said the Gentile can flip it and it's totally fine. So how do we explain that? So they say, Hatam, that where it makes the inference, if it's not cooked machal ben drosai, it's going to be an issue, is a little different. It's going to otve besilta, vishakle ove kochavim, ve'otve betanura. It's where I put it in a basket. At least that's Rosh's interpretation of what a silta is. I put it in a basket. In other words, I put it on the fire, and then I took it off the fire, and then the Gentile came and put it back on. If it wasn't machal ben drosai when I took it off, it's a problem when the Gentile puts it back on. But if it was already a third of the way cooked, then it doesn't matter, because I already made it edible. And then that doesn't contradict the original statement, which is, I put it on the fire, they flipped it. If the Gentile hadn't come, it would have just continued cooking from my action. I didn't take it off. And that's why there's no contradiction. And now going back to this halach of Shmuel, Tanya Namihachi, here's a braita to support. Meniach Yisrael basar al gabei gchalim. I could put meat on the coals. Uba ove kochavim umahapech bo, and then the Gentile comes and flips it. Ad shevo Yisrael mi beit hakneset or mi beit midrash. In other words, I go out to the beit knesset or the beit midrash, and in the meanwhile, the Gentile flips it. It's fine. Ve'eno choshesh. I can do that and ask the Gentile to flip it while I'm not around, and that's totally fine, because if I had just left it there, it would have been fine on its own. And likewise, shofetet tishak lera al gabei kira, a woman could put a pot on the fire, ubat oved kochavim, and a Gentile woman could come, umigisa, and she'll mix it, turning out I'm a bet, ad shetavo mi beit hamrachas mi beit hakneset, until she comes back from the bathhouse or the shul. Notice the woman is not in the beit midrash, but she is in the beit knesset and the bathhouse. Ve'ena choshesh, and you don't have to worry, right? That's just a description of where the women generally would go. Obviously, in those days, the women were not in the beit midrash, that we know. But what's interesting is they actually would go to the beit knesset, and anyway, you don't have to worry about the beit knesset. All that's just a side issue. The Gentile's allowed to flip it and watch it. It's totally fine. Another question. What if we flip the case? So that we know. If the Jew puts it on and the Gentile flips it, totally fine. What if the Gentile puts it on and the Jew flips it? Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak kavachomer. We can learn from a kavachomer. Gamro b'yad ovei kochavim mutal. Gamro b'yad Yisrael lo kol sheken. If the ovei kochavim finished the process in the previous one, and we said that's okay. Now let's think about why that would be a kavachomer, right? But let's just finish the line. If the ovei kochavim could finish the process, then of course it's fine when the Jew finishes the process. Now, why would the finishing the process be the issue? Because the whole issue is chatanut. When do you get to chatanut? When you sit and eat together. Often if you cook together, you'll eat together. But if the Gentile is only involved in the beginning and then leaves, then there's less of an issue. So in the case where the Gentile finishes up the process and they're there at the end, comes Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak and says all the more so if the Jew finishes it, it should be no problem. And Itmar Nami was also said, Amar Rabbi Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Chana says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, but Amar Rav Acha Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Either Rabbi Bar Chana or Rav Acha Bar Chana said, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Bein sheniach oved kochavim v'apach Yisrael, Bein sheniach Yisrael v'apach oved kochavim mutal. Okay, either which part of the process. This basically means, and this is very relevant halachically, as long as the Jew is involved in some part of the process. Doesn't need to be the beginning, doesn't need to be the end, but some part of the process. Eino asur ad shetei tchilato v'gamro b'yad oved kochavim. It's only going to be forbidden when the beginning and the end, and what the commentaries explain, what this means is from the beginning all the way through the end, not just the beginning and the end, but from the beginning through the end, the Gentiles with the food, that's when it's a problem. The Jews involved in some way, it's okay. Now, there's a very famous machloket between the Shulchan Aruch, which is the general Sephardi psak, and the Ashkenazi psak, which is the Ramah and his commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch, about lighting a flame, right? Like turning on the fire, opening the oven, right? Turning on the burner, which is a big, big heter that people use in restaurants and in people's houses. Okay, now, where does that come from? Okay, so we're about to see the sugya where it potentially comes from, but I'll already point out here that until now, we've really been discussing putting the meat on the coals. Nobody discussed turning on the fire. However, this line of the Gentiles involved in the process from start to finish maybe makes an allusion to that. It's not clear. Start to finish could mean from the time the meat went on the fire to the time the meat went off and having nothing to do with the fire at all. That's first of all. Now we're going to get to the sugya which talks about it. And notice we're going to switch from meat to bread. Amar Ravina. Hilchata, the halacha is, harifta, this bread, the shagar ovei kochavim va'afa Yisrael. The Gentile, shagar means he lit up the oven. Okay, usually shagar means to send, but what it means probably is he sent the fire into the oven. In other words, lit up the oven. Ve'afa Yisrael, but the Jew put the bread in there. Inami, or shagar Yisrael va'afa ovei kochavim, or the opposite. The Jew lit the fire and the Gentile put the bread in. Inami, shagar ovei kochavim va'afa ovei kochavim, or the Gentile made the fire, the Gentile put the bread in, but ata Yisrael v'chata b'chitoy, but the Jew came and just stoked the coals in the middle. Shapir dami. That is sufficient. Now, here's a big debate about this case. Is this specifically for bread? This is the reason for the machloket of the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah. Does this apply to bread only? Now, why would it apply to bread only? Why would there be a difference? Because perhaps you could say that the lighting of the fire for bread specifically was an art form. It was a unique, right? There was a way to do it. It had to be done perfectly right. Whereas usually you cook meat, it doesn't really matter is it high, is it low. I mean, you can burn the meat a little more, but the bread has to be at the exact right temperature, and perhaps it's considered more of a malacha than it's possible. And then this would only be true for bread, because then the action of turning on the fire has significance. Whereas when you're doing it for meat or something else, it's not really a significant event. Or it's just bread an example, okay? And bread is just another example, and it could be anything. By the way, another reason the commentaries give to maybe say it's only bread is that also perhaps they were more lenient with bread. We saw about bread is chayei sha'ah, right? It's necessary for people to survive, so maybe because of that, it's more important, and therefore they allowed it, whereas they were more lenient there than they were in other cases. Remember, they wanted lahatir tapat, right? There was already this agenda to try to be lenient, and maybe it was just a leniency they came up with bread, and that's another possible reason to differentiate. So obviously the Ashkenazi psak, which is you can turn on a flame, doesn't understand the sugya that way and thinks that this is true for any case. Okay, moving on, and now we're moving to dag maliach. Okay, so now we have salted fish. That basically we took a fish that wasn't edible, and then the Gentiles salted it. Chizkiah share, Rabbi Yochanan asar. Chizkiah permits, but Rabbi Yochanan forbids, because basically you took something that wasn't edible, you turned it into edible. On the other hand, you didn't really do it with the cooking process, but Rabbi Yochanan says, right, salting it is like cooking it, because it prepares it for eating. Or is it really only cooking with a flame and all that, and that would be chizkiah. Beitzat sluya, roasted egg, bar kapara share, Rabbi Yochanan asar. So again, we have a machlok at this time between bar kapara and Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan is consistent in both. Bar kapara is lenient and says a roasted egg. The Rashi explains it's because the egg is in a shell, and because of that, the Gentile can't even come in contact with the egg. Which is, again, it's not exactly clear what the issue is and why that would be the issue. Some commentators have other opinions about what exactly the issue is here. Right? Some people say it's because you can eat the egg raw, even though people don't really, but theoretically it could be eaten raw, and maybe that means it's in the category of could be eaten raw. Sounds like a better explanation. Anyway, ki ata Rav Dimi amar, echad dag maliach, echad beitzat tluya. Okay, so when Rav Dimi came from Israel, he had a bit of a different tradition about this. Both the dag maliach and the beitzat tluya, chizkia ubar kapara sharu. The two of them permitted both. Not that one permitted one and one permitted the other, but the two of them together permitted both of them. They both agreed. And Rabbi Yochanan asar, that's the same. Rabbi Yochanan forbade both. Now we're going to hear a story, a bit of an interesting story, the dangers of being a posek, or the hazards in the job. Rabbi Chia Parva'a ikla lebei Reish Galuta. So Rabbi Chia Parva'a comes to the house of Reish Galuta. Now the Reish Galuta is the exilarch, very wealthy. Sometimes the exilarch had some thugs around and people that were involved in they weren't always the greatest of people that hung out in the house of the Reish Galuta. And now we're going to see a story that certainly supports that. He comes to the Reish Galuta, Amrele, Beitzat Tluya Mai. So they asked him, what's the story with Beitzat Tluya? It was cooked by a Gentile. Obviously, the exilarch had all these workers, probably had people in the kitchen that weren't Jewish. So Amar Lahu, he says to them, first, Chizkiah bar kapara sharu, Rabbi Yochanan aser. Okay, so there's machloket, he tells them. But he says, two people say it's okay, and one person says it's not. And when there's two against one, we pass them like two, so yeah, it's going to be good. That was the answer they wanted to hear. Perhaps that's why they asked him. They knew he was going to be lenient. But then, Amar Lahu Rav Zvi must have been around there, and he said, Lo titzitule, don't listen to him. It's not true. You have to be stringent. Hachi Amar Abaye, because Abaye said, Hilchata kavatei to Rabbi Yochanan. Abaye paskin like Rabbi Yochanan. So you have to listen to Rabbi Yochanan, and you can't eat it. Well, they didn't like what he said. Ashkihu neguta d'chala, they fed him this very strong vinegar, v'nach nafshe, and they killed him. Sounds like they poisoned him. They didn't like his psak, and they poisoned him with food. Terrible story. I don't know what it means. If you don't like the psak you get, you could poison your rabbi. Certainly I don't think the Gemara, it's interesting the Gemara doesn't go farther about this and what happened to them after, but it's a little bit of a crazy story. That's why I started with the hazards of the job of a postgate. Somebody doesn't like your psak, look what could happen. Tanu Rabbanan. Now we're going to get into some other things which aren't really cooked, but some sort of process. They go through some sort of process, or we're going to see. Tanu Rabbanan, a kafrisin, which are caper buds. Okay, so the capers, they would salt, but really theoretically you could eat them when they're raw, even though most people don't. Kaflutot, which are leeks. Vehamatalia, matalia, which we're going to see what it is. Hachamin, hot water, which we know doesn't change when you boil it. Haklayot, toasted grains, which we saw already, parched grains. Shalahen mutarin. Okay, if they're Gentiles, they're all permitted. Beitzat tluya, as we saw before, this supports Rabbi Yochanan, and this braita, a roasted egg is forbidden. Shemen, what about their oil? Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, ubeitino nimnu alavi tirua. This we saw Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, actually, not Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. Rabbi Yehuda, his grandson, who was also the Nasi, him and his court permitted the oil. So now they say, Tanya. Okay, now we're going to have a bright to what this matalia is. He matalia, he pasilia, he shiata. Okay, it's telling you what this is. It's pasilia, and it's also shiata. Okay, that doesn't help us. Well, my shiata, what is this? Amar Rabbi Barbacan, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Ha'arba'im shnin denafikai uvada mimitzrayim. Okay, this is 40 years. Now, there's two ways to interpret this. 40 years. 40 years ago. This was exported from Egypt. Or perhaps it means 40 years ago, they taught us how to make this, how to prepare it, which we're going to see in a minute. Rabbi Barachana Didamar, after Rabbi Barachana quoted Rabbi Yochanan, is saying it was 40 years, he himself said, Hashitin shnin de nafikayu vadami Mitzrayim. This was 60 years that whatever happened. Okay, whether it was exported from Egypt or it was imported to us from Egypt, basically, or it was this recipe, kind of how to prepare it, came from Egypt. Velo pligi. So first they just tell you, there's really no debate between them, the 40 and the 60 years. Mar b'shnei or mar b'shnei. Each one said at a different time, one when it was 60 years and one when it was 40 years. Okay, anyway, how do you prepare it? So, maite bizra de karpasa, you take seeds of karpas, ubizra de kitana, and seeds of flax, ubizra de shablalita, and seeds of, I forgot what this is, tiltan, fenugreek, vitaru luhu bahade adade bipashure, and you soak it in lukewarm water. Now, the reason why this could be potentially bishul akum is even if you did it in hot water, and theoretically the seeds cooked, it's not considered bishul akum. Okay, so what would you do? So they would take these seeds, Okay, this is what you often do with seeds. And you let them sprout. So you put them in warm water to sprout. So then you leave them until they sprout. And then you bring new earthenware vessels. And you fill them up with water. And then you put this kind of clay, I think it's a red clay. And then and then you stick the seeds in. And then you go into the bathhouse. You'll see in a minute why this is relevant. Because this is what people would do with them. Okay, so they would wait till they sprouted, they put them in soil, and then they would go into the bathhouse and leave them outside. When they would come out, they would have already sprouted. Okay, it was like this miraculous thing that, you would go into the bathhouse, you would come out, and they would already grow. They would eat it, and it would cool them down. Because when you go into a bathhouse, you're in very hot waters, and you would want to jump in. Often people nowadays jump into cold water after, so they would need something to cool their bodies down. So they would eat this thing that had just sprouted while they were in the bathhouse. The kaire, I didn't finish reading. Kaire means it cooled them down. Mibinita derashai, from the hairs on their head, atufar dekarayo, till the nails on their toes. Okay, it would completely cool their body down. It sounds like a bit of a crazy thing. And in fact, Amar Ravashi, Amar li Rabbi Chanina, Milin. This is stom words. People make this up. It's Baba Mises, right? This isn't true. It doesn't happen. Va'amar le bimilin. Other people say no. He said it happens with words, meaning they would also have to say some sort of incantation, like a spell. And that's how this would happen in a magical kind of manner. Okay, anyway, why did we do this? Because we wanted to explain what this matalia is, that if a Gentile prepares it, you're actually allowed to eat it. Tanu Rabbanan. Hakusvan shalovdei kochavim shuchmu. Okay, these are the dregs of the dates that they would take, or the date husks they would take from after they would prepare beer or wine. They would take them of ovdei kochavim shuchmu. Okay, so the date husks of the Gentiles that they warmed up in chamin, in hot water. Biyoreg dolaf, they cook them up. Okay, people would cook these up and then eat them. If they cook them up in a big pot, asul. Biyorek tana mutal. Depends on the size of the pot. What does this have to do with anything? This isn't actually bishul akum. I'm not sure why. Maybe because you would never eat it at the king's table or something. But the issue here is they cooked it in their pots. And now we're going to talk about kashrus. The pots basically absorb flavor and then spit out flavor. So in a small pot, it's okay. So now we want to know why. And before we get to why, what does it mean small? What does small mean? How small is small? Ezuhu yorek tana. What's considered small? Amar biyanai. Kol she'ein tzipor dror yachol likanes b'tocha. If you can't fit a bird or a swallow, which is a very small bird in it, then that's a small one. V'dilma b'anya. Why? Because the assumption is you can't fit meat in there or something not kosher. It's too small. So now they say, V'dilma admuya admua va'ayilua. What do you mean? You could chop it up into small pieces and put it into a small pot. So there could have been non-kosher stuff cooked in there. Ela kol she'en rosh tzipor dror yachol likanes b'tocha. It must be something so small that even the head of a swallow, which is teeny, can't fit in there. That's already, I don't even know what kind of teeny pot you're cooking anything in. But now they say, V'hatani, but it says in a braita, echad yorek dola v'echad yorek tana mutal. But it says even a big one is allowed. So how can we explain that? Lo kashya, don't worry, not difficult. Hakiman damar noten tam lifgam asul. Hakiman damar noten tam lifgam mutal. The whole issue of taste in pots changes after 24 hours. Because after 24 hours, the vessel already spits out bad flavor. It's already rotten, spoiled. So if you wait the 24 hours, the question is, it spits out bad flavor, is that permitted or not? So one opinion says it's not permitted, and that's the one that says you can't use a big pot. But the one that says it's permitted thinks if it spits out bad stuff, it's okay as long as 24 hours have passed. That's how we reconcile the contradiction. Now we move on to oil. Okay? Amar Rav Shesha. Now oil we already said they permitted, but what if you cook up the oil? So hai mishcha shlika da aramai. Asul. If they cook it up, it's a problem. Now what's the problem? Oil can be eaten raw. It shouldn't be bishul akum. Amar Rav Safra l'may nichusha. What are we worried about? Imi shuma yeruve. Maybe we're worried they mixed wine into the oil and when they cooked it up. But Mr. Sorry, that would ruin the oil. So we're definitely not worried about that. And then, wine would be an issue of yain nesach. And as I said before, if it's bishul akum, well, you could eat the oil raw. If you're worried about their their kelim, their vessels, that the taste will come out. Well, we hold that when it gives bad flavor, it's actually permitted. And therefore, it's actually permitted. Okay, so they asked him, right, what Rav Sheshet asked, and Rav Safra basically says it's fine. Because so now they asked Rabbi Asi, Hi ahene shlike taramai. Now we take dates that they cooked up. Ma Julio lo tibailach devadai shara. Clearly sweet ones, since you could have eaten them raw, no problem. Mirire, the bitter ones, lo tibailach devadai asire. You wouldn't even ask about those, the bitter ones, because for sure it's forbidden. You can't eat them when they're raw. So now they say, what was the question? Ki tibailach mitziai mai. So he said, I want to know about the in-between ones. Sort of could be eaten, sort of not, right? They're a little sweet, but they're also bitter. Amar lehu mai tibai lehu. Why are you asking? De Rebbe asal. My rabbi forbade, and Manu, who's that rabbi? Levi. Levi forbade it. That's the answer he gets. Shetita. Now we're going to talk about shetita. Okay, this is a type of porridge that they would make sometimes with grains and sometimes with with lentils. So now they're going to talk about, we'll learn about the different ways they prepared it. They would mix it probably with honey, and then they would add either wine or vinegar. Now, water or vinegar. So if it's very sweet, then you're going to add vinegar to it, right? And that was the lentils. They would add the vinegar to kind of undo the sweetness of them. So Rav Share Avodah Shmuel v'Levi Asre. So we have Rav on one side who permits this if a Gentile prepared it, and we have Shmuel, the father of Shmuel and Levi, on the other side that forbid it. Right? We already said this porridge kind of stuff would go on Shulchan Melachim, so it's not bishul akum. The question is there a concern that maybe there's vinegar in it? And then what if there isn't? We'll see then why would there be an issue. So why did Avu and Shmuel, Shmuel and Levi Aser, and exactly which case are they debating? Definitely the grains, okay, wheat and barley, nobody thinks it's a problem because they only put water in them. But lentils, dechala, if you added vinegar to it, everyone obviously agrees it's forbidden because the vinegar could be from wine that was used as a libation. The whole question is, what if you have lentils, porridge that they only put water in? Do we say, Marsaval, the one who says no, Gazuin anha tuha? You have to say, well, if we allow this, people might think that the lentils with vinegar is okay, and it's not. Umar savar lo gazlina. And the other opinion is, no, we don't make a gzera. Everyone knows the difference between the ones that have vinegar and the ones that don't. V'ikad amri. That's one version of the whole machloket and what they debate and what they don't. But some people say, everyone agrees, even Rav agrees, who mocked here before. No, Rav says no. Any lentils are forbidden, even if there's no vinegar, because people confuse lentil porridge and lentil porridge. They're not going to know the difference necessarily. But the question is, if we make porridge out of wheat and barley, where definitely there's no vinegar in it, and you can obviously distinguish between that and lentils, still, Marsavar Gazrina Ha Tuha. Avodah Shmuel and Levi say no. Still, if we allow that porridge, people will think you can allow the other porridge, and therefore you can't eat it if it was made by a Gentile. Again, not for bishul akum, not for the issue of their pots, but for the issue of the wine. Umar Savar Lo Gazlina. And Rav says, no, there's no reason to make a gzera. Amar Rav, and Rav says another statement. This is a total, not really so significant for the purposes of the sugya, but Tremi Neshti Ta'a, Shadar Barzilai Giladi le David. Okay, and in Sefer Shmuel, Barzilai Giladi sends food to David, and he sends him Mishkav v'Sapot. He sends also other things, places to sleep and sit, and couches, uklei yotzel, different kinds of utensils, chitim, useorim, v'kemach v'kali, so wheat and barley and flour and roasted grains, ufol, okay, which is a kind of bean, and adashim, lentils, v'kale, and toasted lentils. So now they're going to say, notice there's kali twice. The toasted is what they make the porridge out of. So there's one's made of lentils and one's made of grains. V'hashtahu dekam mafke tzane l'shuke denahardia. Now the fact that nowadays people take out these pots full of porridge into the shuk denahardia that were made by Gentiles, and nobody's concerned for the stringent opinion of the father of Shmuel and Levi. People actually eat this stuff from Gentiles. Last part for today, kfashim. Okay, these are pickled items. Shedarkan late betochan yain. That often people put wine in them. This was listed in the Mishnah as things you can't have from Gentiles. Amar Chizkiah lo shanu ela shedarkan. This is only if it's typically using wine. And then, so what did the Mishnah say? Let's just review. It's actually forbidden to eat, but you can benefit from it. So now he distinguishes. He says that's only if people generally, like let's say 80% of the people do. Aval biyadua asur afilu b'hana'ah. But if you know, meaning now, this could mean one of two things. Either you know they put wine in it, or it's known that everybody, 100% of the people put it in, then you can assume there's wine in it and you can't benefit. Umaishnami morayis, desharu rabbanan b'hana'ah. But the morayis, which is this fish brine, the rabbis, this machloka rabbis and Rabbi Meir, in a minute we'll discuss Rabbi Meir's position, but the rabbis forbid it. So why do they forbid the morayis, this fish brine or fish stew? So the reason is hatam, right? I'm sorry, there the rabbis permit it. Okay, so here, right there we know they put in and we permit it. And here we know they put in, or we can, or it's likely, sorry. In both cases, it's likely they put in, and here it's forbidden. No, I just said that wrong. Here we know, and they're right, if everybody does it, then it's forbidden. And in the morayis, they permitted it. So now they say, what's the difference? Hatam, why do they put the wine or the vinegar into the fish brine? The reason why they do it, it's actually wine. The reason why they do it is lavure zuama. It's to get rid of the bad smell. Hacha lemituke tama. But here it's coming to make it sweeter. So now it's very interesting, because if the wine is coming to sweeten it, then you want the taste of the wine. If the wine is just coming to take away a bad taste, it's kind of like it's invisible. It's just sort of getting rid of a bad taste, but it's not that you want the wine in there that's going to change the taste for it to be a better taste or a sweeter taste. And therefore, you're allowed to, again, you can't eat it anyway, but you are allowed to benefit from it. Rabbi Yochanan Amal, but Rabbi Yochanan said, different from Chizkiah, afilu biyodeh nami mutar. He thinks even if everybody puts wine in it, it's still permitted. To which they say, according to him, Maishnami Morayis the Rabbi Meir, the Asr B'hana'ah. Now we have to compare him to Rabbi Meir. Why would Rabbi Meir say Morayis is permitted and you say this is forbidden? Now here we're going to go in a different direction, which is Hacha Yediya Mamasho, Hacha Lo Yediya Mamashan. In the case of the pickling, okay, so again, if you pickle with, everybody pickles with wine in it, or vinegar in it, which is really comes from wine. Everybody pickles with vinegar. Rabbi Yochanan says it's fine. Why is it fine? Because lo yadia mamashan. In the end, what are you eating? You're eating the pickles. You're not eating the juice that it's, the stuff that it's sitting in. So in the end, right, the brine, I don't know if you call it brine, but whatever it is. So you don't really know if there's wine in what you're eating. But in the fish brine, you're eating the brine. There's no fish in there. It's just the sauce from it. And that's what you're eating. You're dipping your bread in it or whatever people would do with it. And therefore, that's going to be an issue because you're actually eating the wine that's in it. So that's why Rabbi Meir is going to be more strict there, according to Rabbi Yochanan, and Rabbi Yochanan can be more lenient here. So we had two opposite approaches about why be more strict with the morayis or why be more lenient with the morayis. Okay? So that's the end of our daf. We're going to do a quick review. So we started with the issue of the criteria for bishul akum. We talked about both the criteria of the food itself. It has to be the kind of food that can go on shulchan malachim or couldn't be raw. And then we went into how much involvement of a Jew is necessary, or how much involvement of a Gentile will mess things up for the food. From there we jumped to topics of kashrut of the vessels, concern for Gentile vessels, and then we got into also concerns of wine, nesach. So we kind of mixed a bunch of issues here, all relating to foods that one wants to eat from Gentiles. And with that, we'll finish for today. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom and Shavuot Tov.